Okay.
You're talking to me?
No, that was the computer saying that we're recording now.
Sure, I can do that. How did I do?
You did very well. You did very well. You blew the top out of the curve. Reminder that next week, if memory serves me, next week the term paper is due. Those of you doing it on the 26th, yes. So you need to be working on that, getting that in shape. And after tonight, we have 3 more classes to finish on November the 9th.
So the term paper will be turned in before the 3 classes then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Gives me a little time to read over and grade them and get them back to you before the course is over. All right. Take your Bible, turn to the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 11. And tonight we have David and Bathsheba. And then we'll deal after that with David and the crimes of Amnon and Absalom in chapters 13 and 14. But we're in chapter 11 right now, 2 Samuel chapter 11. And we start out right off the bat. It's the time when kings go out to battle. The English Standard says in the spring of the year. Well, just like every other part of the world, there are times in the Middle East when weather and the demands of the seasons hamper battle. Now, in our mechanized world, we don't think so much about that, but just in this past year, we've heard a lot about the Afghans and the time of battle and so forth, and that's a good illustration of what we're talking about here. Because in the springtime, when winter breaks, things thaw, then it's time to till the fields, to plow the fields and plant the seed. Prepare the fields, get them ready, put the seed in. But once the fields are planted, then, depending on what you're growing, obviously, you've got at least several weeks and usually several months until the harvest comes. And so you go through cycles in the year of mad, frantic labor to get food, punctuated by periods where once the labor is done, you've got a break, basically. So where are we in this cycle? Well, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to war, go out to battle. So the harvest is several months away, but the seed has been planted. The fields are ready now. Basically, at this point, it's up to God. The wives, the children, they can go out and they can weed the fields, but the heavy labor of planting has been done. And so they pick the time for their battles accordingly. You go to 1 Chronicles chapter 20, and in verse 1, you have the same reference of this. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So that's the parallel account. At this point, it's wartime in the cycle of the year. You have two time frames in the year when it was typical for ancient peoples, primitive peoples, to go to war. One would be in the late spring going into summer after the crops have been planted, and the other would be in the fall after the harvest before the winter sets in. In the meantime, though, they have to be home to plant, they have to be home to harvest, or the family's going to starve through the winter. So they have their seasons of battle. Now, question, just right off the bat, you read here in verse 1, David sent Joab, his servants, and the army with him, sent all Israel with him to deal with Rabbah and the Ammonites. But notice what it says. David remained at Jerusalem. Now, David at this point is 40 something years old, probably. He's been king in Jerusalem for several years. He may be in his 50s at this point. We don't really know for sure. But the point is that up to this point, he has been in his conduct a pretty clear contrast with King Saul. Now he sends the army out, but does not accompany them. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, and in verse 20, what's one of the things that the elders of Israel specifically said to Samuel about why they wanted a king? We want him to rule over us, to judge us. We want to be just like the nations around us in all through chapter 8. But in verse 20, they said, we want him to fight our battles. We want him to lead in battle. In essence, they were saying we want him to be our champion, much like Goliath had been for the Philistines, even though Goliath was not king. We want our king out where we can see him. Now, God would tell Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me from being king over them. And what was the implicit complaint there in 1 Samuel chapter 8 that the elders of Israel, the princes of Israel, were bringing against God as their king? We can't see him. When we go fight the Philistines, we can see the Philistine king. When we go fight the Ammonites, we can see Nahash, the Ammonites. And when we go fight all of these other heathen peoples, we can see their king. We can see their champion. We can't see our king. We want a king we can see. That's the gist of what they were saying when they said, give us a king so we can be like the nations around us. Now, put that in New Testament terms. In essence, what they're saying is, we want to walk by sight, not by faith. And yet, God has always called on his people to walk by faith and not by sight. Now, having said that, let's make this important. Let's emphasize this important point. Walking by faith is never walking blindly. God never calls on us to walk blindly. He never just says, well, just trust me. He always gives evidence. He always gives a basis. He always gives a reason for us to have faith in him. So faith is not blindness, and walking by faith is not walking blindly. But when the people say we want to walk by sight, not by faith, that's the gist of what they're saying. Give us a king. Now we come to David, and David remains behind. There's no explanation given in the scriptures for why. We have 1 Chronicles chapter 20, two parallel accounts. They both tell us the same thing. He stayed behind. Don't know why. Now, if he's in his 50s, maybe he's beginning to feel his age. It won't be long till he really does begin to feel his age, but there's no explanation given. What is significant about David's role as king, is that the power of his kingdom and the power of his influence and his example begins to tilt over at this point. Up to this point, David has conducted himself wisely. David has performed admirably as king. We have seen him on the incline, increasing, growing, consolidating, doing everything well, basically. At this point, we see his rule peak and begin to tilt down. his reign is going to diminish, in a sense, from here on. So, whatever reason, he's home taking a nap while the army is out in the field fighting the Ammonites. And so we come to verse 2. Late one afternoon, he arises from his couch, strolling on the roof of the king's house, strolling around on the palace, and surveying his domain, as it were. What does he see? Here's a beautiful woman bathing. It's the time of year when kings go out to battle. So it's mid to late spring going into summer. It's the time of year that temperatures are starting to rise. It's getting warm. Remember that Jerusalem is about on the same latitude as Atlanta. So the weather in Jerusalem is actually, in many ways, a lot like the weather here in Atlanta area. It's not as humid typically, but the temperatures are roughly the same. It gets hot in the springtime. The explanation for her bathing on the roof may be as simple as it was too hot in the house. It's late in the evening. The sun had an opportunity to shine on the house. The house typically would be built of mud brick or stone. You let it sit in the sun all day, what happens? It absorbs that radiant heat, keeps you warm at night, but in the late afternoon inside the house, it's hot. That may be the simplest explanation for why she's up on the roof bathing. Now, also, the construction, the structures of that day were not typically individual houses like ours. They were what we would think of as more like row houses joined together, and they didn't have big yards around them. They opened directly into the street. They might have, if it was a particularly prosperous home, it might be built on a square with a little courtyard inside. But typically, the space that we would use like a front porch or a back porch, a place to go sit out in the cool in the evening or whatnot, would be upstairs on a flat roof. David is surveying his domain, his kingdom. Down here, here's a beautiful woman bathing. Well, why is she bathing where the king can see her? Very possibly it never occurred to her that anybody would be looking down on her. There is nothing in the biblical text that suggests that Bathsheba was up there in plain sight, deliberately trying to attract his attention. More likely, she's up there because it is a cool, quiet, relatively private place, could not be seen from the street, could not be seen from close by. It's just a comfortable place for her to clean up. Don't know that with certainty, but there's nothing that suggests that she's trying to seduce anybody. She was a beautiful woman. The scripture says so. Why would she bathe where he could see her? She doesn't know his schedule. She may not even be aware that he's at home, so to speak. Her husband is not at home. Her husband is one of David's mighty men. Uriah is one of his 30 over in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 29. He's one of the elevated men of David, a faithful servant. He's out in the field with the army. She is the daughter of Eliam, or as he's called elsewhere, Amiel, who is also one of David's mighty men. But David sees her, and she's beautiful. Well, let's take stock. David's got Michal, whom he has no interest in. She's going to die childless. He's got Abigail, smart woman. He's got Ahinoam. He's got other wives. He's got a house full of kids. What does he need with another woman? Need never enters into this. Desire does, lust does. And that's the root of this whole incident. Look down at verse 3. David sent, inquired about the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So first, he calls somebody in the palace, servant perhaps. Who is that pretty girl? And they either know or they find out. That's Uriah's wife. In other words, that's the wife and the daughter of two of your trusted servants, Your Majesty. Two of your trusted servants. Now look at the next verse. He sent messengers. He sent servants. Go fetch her for me. At verse 3, it's pretty clear. Lust, desire is his motive. From a purely human point of view, that's hardly surprising. He's a man, she's a beautiful woman. She's a beautiful woman in a state of undress, even though perhaps she is utterly unaware that she's being observed. Now, if we want to put this in its darkest tone, she's up there trying to seduce him, but there's nothing in the scripture that suggests that. So he sends for her. Who'd he send? Who did he send to fetch her to the palace?
And messengers.
Messengers, servants. We don't know who specifically by name, but here's the point. Somebody in the palace knew that he was asking about Bathsheba, the daughter of Amiel, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Somebody in the palace knew the context of his inquiry. Who's that pretty girl? That beautiful woman? Somebody in the palace knew that he sent for her because they were the person that he sent, or the people that he sent to bring her. Now, having said all of that, let's point out, it says in verse 4, he sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. All right. There's no indication of any fight or resistance on her part. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 21 echoes Exodus chapter 20, the 10 Commandments. You shall not covet. You shall not desire your neighbor's wife. Guess what? David is coveting, he's lusting after, he's desiring, and he is maneuvering to take his neighbor's wife. In James chapter 1, pick up at verse 13 and go down to verse 15, and notice James says, let no man say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God. God did this to me. God does not tempt anyone, neither can God be tempted. What's the summary of it in verses 14 and 15? Each person is drawn away or is seduced by his own lust and then enticed, and the net result, lust, when it conceives, when it takes action, produces sin. And what does sin result in? Separation from God, death, spiritual death. Here's David explicitly violating the commandment. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. I'm not just coveting her, I'm taking her. He's doing it to himself. Nobody's forcing him. She is not making any outcry over this. Now, the law did provide for the woman who is raped that if she cries out, if she fights back, basically protests, then she is held guiltless in this. There's no indication of any outcry here. Now, we look at the situation. He's the king. And it's not entirely beyond the realm of possibility that her reasoning is, I have no right to refuse him. That certainly was the thinking of medieval European kings.
She was probably brought to the palace at sword point.
Very probably brought to the palace at sword point, or at least against her will, perhaps.
Exactly.
Regardless, there's no outcry recorded. Now, it says that she's purifying herself from her uncleanness, and that takes us back to Leviticus chapter 15 and verse 19, basically tells us that she is just, not to be crude, but she has just finished that time of the month for her. So she is, ceremonially speaking, she is no longer unclean. But look down here. Yeah, you're right. She is effectively, she's primed to conceive. Well, verse 5, she goes home into verse 4. Verse 5 sends word to the palace to David, I'm pregnant. Complications. Flip over to Leviticus chapter 20 for just a moment. And notice there, in Leviticus chapter 20, Moses is talking about the penalties associated with child sacrifice. Yeah. So at verse 6, he says, if a person turns to mediums and necromancers, somebody inquiring after the dead, then here's a penalty for this. I will set my face against that person, and so forth. But jump down here to verse 10, Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Well, that's pretty blunt, isn't it? And there's no exception made unless it's the king. Under the law of Moses in Israel, the penalty for what David instigated, whether willingly or not on Bathsheba's part, the penalty by rights is execution. Complications. Now we have a pregnant Bathsheba. So, how does David respond? David comes down to us through the scriptures as the man after God's own heart. But David is not always that man. And here he is emphatically not that upright, penitent, humble man. You look at verses 6, 7, and 8. What is his response to the news that his sin with Bathsheba is going to become obvious. Now, there's nothing here that indicates she's trying to blackmail him or anything like that. Simply, hello, I'm pregnant. And the implication being Uriah hasn't been around for a while. He's going to know this is not his child. So you look at verses 6, 7, and 8. What's David's first instinct? He's
Try
been,
to trick Uriah into
okay,
falling for.
try to conceal his involvement, basically. You look at 2 Samuel 11, verses 6, 7, and 8. He sent word to Joab, send me Uriah, send Uriah home. And so Joab sends Uriah home, sends him to David. David asks, how's the battle going? How's Joab doing as general? And what are the spirits of the people, those soldiers like? How's the army feel? And all the general beating around the bush, not really getting to why you're here questions that he would ask. And then he says, Uriah, go home. Go wash your feet. Go take it easy. Have a furlough, have a break. And then to kind of urge him on, he sends a gift, a present along with him from the king's house, sends some food and things like that. Very possibly sends some alcohol of some sort. Things that would represent reward. But while his fellow soldiers are in harm's way, while his king's army is in the field, Uriah is not going home to Bathsheba. Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. So, hypocrisy on David's part. I'll just try to hide this, try to sweep it under the rug. How many times are we tempted to deal with our sins exactly the same way? Go back 20 some odd years to the administration of Bill Clinton. Whether you loved him or hated him or didn't care one way or the other about him, politically speaking, we look at Bill Clinton and what do we remember about him as president? One of the standout aspects of his presidency.
Lewinsky.
Yeah, that little dark-haired girl, Monica Lewinsky.
She made him, man.
He was playing around on his wife, and turns out had been apparently all along. And how did a whole lot of his supporters respond? Well, what he does in his private life is nobody's business. It's just about sex. It doesn't matter. Doesn't affect his ability to be president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know what? All of that could be entirely true. And it does not change the fact that he was demonstrating that he was unfaithful to the promises that he had made to his wife. Now, how did he try to handle it when it was exposed? Just try to cover it up, try to deny it, try to divert attention, make it go away. Well, that's what David is doing. Instead of acknowledging his wrong, he's trying to make it go away.
Same thing with David.
How is that any different than Saul?
Sin is sin.
That's right. It's not. It's a distinction without a difference. Saul, the king, departed from the Lord and sinned here and there and persecuted David and turned away from God. In this moment in David's life, what's David doing? He's not focused on God.
Right.
His attention is not where it ought to be. And so his plan to pass this child off as Uriah's fails. Uriah slept at the door of the king's house, and they told David, Uriah didn't go home. Why didn't you go home, Uriah? David asks, summons him back. Why didn't you go down to your house? And his answer, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths or in tents, in huts. And my lord Joab, General Joab, and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. And what's Uriah doing without even knowing it here?
He's honoring him, right?
Well, he's putting David to shame, basically. Although he doesn't even realize it.
Yeah, he doesn't know the circumstance.
Where is David supposed to be, according to the whole idea of give us a king?
In front of the animal.
He needs to be out there in the field. And instead, he's home sleeping in his own bed with Uriah's wife. And Uriah is saying, I'm going to be where I belong, not taking it easy at the expense of my fellow soldiers. So, verses 12 and 13, plan number 2. Plan number 1, send him home to his wife and cover David's sin. Plan number 2, verses 12 and 13. So, stay here today also, and I'll send you back tomorrow. Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. David invited him, ate in David's presence, drank so that he made him drunk. In the evening, he went up to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. So plan number 2, I'll get him drunk and then he'll go home. Nope, didn't work. Plan number 3, verses 14 and 15. You see David beginning to be a little bit frantic here, don't you? A little bit worried. So verses 14 and 15, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, sent it by the hand of Uriah. That's cold, isn't it? That is cold. He wrote Uriah's death warrant and then had Uriah deliver it to the executioner. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. So, in effect, the very letter that Uriah carries to Joab says, murder Uriah for me. I've got to get rid of him. Murder Uriah for me. Now, Joab doesn't seemingly know anything about why. He just knows what the king wants done. Plan number 1, cover it up, failed. Plan number 2, get him drunk and maybe he'll cover it up for me. That failed. Plan number 3, well, I'm just going to have to kill him and get him out of the way. That worked. Go ahead.
But if I'm correct, what I noticed is that he gave Uriah the letter, so Uriah's loyalty never opened the letter.
Yeah.
and saw
Yeah,
his doomsday.
that's right.
his
Uriah
legacy.
carries the letter that is his death sentence,
Right.
but he doesn't know what's in it.
He doesn't, and he had a chance to.
Well, except the letter undoubtedly is sealed. You don't break the seal on somebody else's mail. It's none of his, I'm acting as a courier. It's not my responsibility to read it. In fact, I'm not permitted to. So he delivers the letter. Joab reads it. I don't know why. Put him out there in the hot part of the battle and leave him. So verses 16 and 17, that's what they did. Joab is besieging the city of Rabbah, and he assigns Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men, where the Ammonites were fighting bravely and fighting hard. And then he pulls back and Uriah is killed. And so Joab sends word back. Verses 18 and 19 and 20 and 21. Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises and he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Yerubbasheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebes? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So that tells us, reading between the lines, as it were, that tells us a little bit about the battle. Apparently, carrying out David's command to kill Uriah must have cost some other lives as well. Because the messenger comes back, it was a hot fight. It was a tough battle. And if the king's response basically is, well, why did you put my soldiers in that position? Uriah is dead. And that'll tell him everything he needs to know. This is the cost of doing what you told me to do. I had to put other men in harm's way, and that comes with a cost. It's not stated, but it is clearly implied that there were others affected. And this illustrates an important lesson about the nature of sin. How many times in our lives as adults have we heard someone try to excuse or justify their involvement in some sin with the claim, well, I'm not hurting anybody but myself. It doesn't affect me, so it's none of your business, Mr. President. Sin is never limited in its impact and its consequences to only the sinner. The consequences of sin are always greater than the sinner expects. So Joab instructs the messenger, here's what you tell King David. The messenger went, came and told David all that Joab sent to tell him. The men gained an advantage over us, verse 23, came out against us in the field. We drove them back to the entrance of the gate. The archers shot at your servants from the wall. Look at verse 24. Some of the king's servants are dead. It wasn't just Uriah that died. And your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. And now just, it was cold. It was just stone cold hearted for David to send Uriah with his own death sentence in his hand. But now look at his response to Joab in the aftermath of that. David said to the messenger, verse 25, thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you. For the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. Okay, messenger, here's what you tell him. It happens, no big deal. David plotted the murder of a man whose wife he defiled. And then, when it cost not just that loyal servant's life, but the lives of other faithful men, what was David's response? So what? When a sinner is trying to conceal or deny his or her sin, in that moment, no additional sin matters in their judgment. If I can accomplish what I want to accomplish, if I can hide what I want to hide, then whatever I have to pile on top of that sin doesn't matter. Sin compounds. That's a good way to put it, Ms. Brown. Sin compounds. So, David has just murdered Uriah. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. David took Bathsheba into his harem, basically, as soon as possible, so that they would be married as long as possible before the baby is born. Now, the normal mourning period for a death would have been 7 days, would have been a week. What's David doing? He's doing everything humanly possible to hide the fact that he has sinned. He's doing everything humanly possible to hide the fact that he has become an adulterer by this sin. Sin compounds. But the Lord was displeased. And so it's going to be downhill from here on. David's experience as king, David has hit the high point of his rulership. And his experience as king is going to be downhill from this point forward. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to have God's favor.
Right.
But consequences are a bummer, because he's going to have to deal with the consequences of his sin from now on. So, come over into chapter 12. The thing displeased the Lord, and so he sends Nathan. Nathan is a prophet. Nathan has been David's counselor at times. Go back to when he wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant and build a temple, and what's Nathan's response? Hey, that's great. Do everything that's in your heart. And then God says, no, you go back and tell him, And Nathan has to go back and deny that idea. So God sends Nathan to visit David. And he starts with a parable. in verses 1 through 6 in chapter 12. Two men in a particular town, a wealthy man and a poor man. The wealthy man had herds and flocks, just had plenty. And in a day when wealth was measured in part by the size of your flocks and your herds of livestock, he's a rich man. The poor man, on the other hand, has one little ewe lamb, a little female lamb. And notice at verse 3, he had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. In other words, the rich man had livestock. What did the poor man have?
Yeah, one.
Just
Now-
one little donkey,
Okay,
a lamb rather.
He had a family pet.
there you go.
Yeah.
The Jews did not keep dogs as pets. Dogs are unclean animals. They would run them out. They didn't want them hanging around. They'd throw rocks at them, sticks at them, run them out. They were unclean. They didn't keep dogs as pets. They did not keep cats as pets typically. Cats, among other things, were reminiscent of idolatry in Egypt. But they did keep lambs. And what do we have in verse 3? You have the description of a man who has a family pet. This little lamb ate at the table, basically. He treated it like a child. How many times just drive through town and count how many bumper stickers or stickers on the windows you see, or little paw prints you see on cars that say dog mommy or dog daddy or something. Well, this guy is a lamb daddy. He's got a pet lamb. It's not livestock. He's not raising this lamb to be slaughtered and feed his family. It's the family pet. So, a traveler comes to the rich man, verse 4. And notice how he describes this. The rich man was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest. He just called the rich man cheap, stingy, unwilling to slaughter one of his own animals to whom he had no particular emotional attachment. They weren't pets, they were just livestock, they were an investment. Unwilling to slaughter one of those, so what does he do? He kidnaps the neighbor's pet, slaughters it, and feeds the visitor with it. Stop right here for a second. When God told King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15, go slaughter the Amalekites from the king down to the beggar in the street, from the father to the mother to the infant in arms, all their herds, all their flocks, all their livestock, wipe them off the face of the earth. What did King Saul do?
Save the best.
He kept the king for a trophy. And he blamed the people, but they saved the best of the herds and the flocks. Oh, but we're going to sacrifice them. Now, flip over to 2 Samuel chapter 24 for just a minute.
Chapter 24.
The very last chapter of 2 Samuel.
24.
24, the last chapter.
Okay.
And here, David has conducted a census. He's counted all of his soldiers basically, and it made the Lord mad. And the Lord sent a pestilence, a plague. 70,000 men died. And now David is going to offer a sacrifice. And he's at the threshing floor of Araunah. the Jebusite. And this man offers the king his oxen and his threshing sledges and all of his implements and tools. Sacrifice my animals, and here's wood to burn them with. And notice what David says. Araunah says to him, I give this to you, verse 23. And what does David say in verse 24? Second Samuel 24 and verse 24.
He's going to pay for it.
That's right. I will not offer to the Lord something that cost me nothing. In other words, if it cost me nothing, it's not a sacrifice. I will pay full value for it. I will not offer to the Lord that which cost me nothing. I wonder where he learned that. You suppose he learned that from Nathan's parable? The rich man slaughters the neighbor's pet lamb to feed the traveler because he's too cheap, too stingy, too selfless, too hard-hearted and uncaring to slaughter one of his own investment lambs. And you look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 5, and David, the king, was enraged. You want to talk about seeing red? He was furious. He assumes that Nathan's telling him an actual incident. As the Lord lives, he basically says, so help me God. The man who has done this thing deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold. Now, David is furious. He had been a shepherd. He knew the value of the lamb. And he decrees a two-part punishment. Number one, that man has to restore the lamb fourfold. He's got to give 4 lambs for having done that, but it doesn't stop there. After that, he had no pity. He shall forfeit his life. This man deserves to die. He had no pity. He had no sympathy, had no empathy for his poor neighbor. And that was the thing that set David off. And then Nathan says, that's you. King, you are the rich man who has stolen his neighbor's pet lamb. And from verse 7 down to verse 14, judgment is decreed. Now, David paid the penalty here. Notice the penalty David pronounced. He shall restore the lamb fourfold. It'll cost him 4 lambs. Well, guess what? Out of his own mouth, he decreed his own punishment. 4 of his own sons preceded him in death. Bathsheba's first child, the child that's going to be born of this adulterous relationship, and then Ammon, and then Absalom, and ultimately Adonijah. 4 of his own sons are going to die because he had stolen a poor man's wife and had no pity. That's the thing. He had no pity he sinned with Bathsheba. Was she a willing participant, or was she a terrified participant, or did she think that he's the king, I don't have any choice, any right? We don't know. But after the fact, I'm pregnant, he had no pity. He could not bring himself to admit what he had done. You're the man. Now listen to the judgment. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Reminder number 1. I made you king. Verse 7.
Where you at?
2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 7.
Oh, okay. You still in 12.
Yeah. So verse 7.
Okay.
I made you king. I preserved you from Saul. I gave you your master's house, your master's wives, the house of Israel and Judah. And notice what he says in verse 8. If this were too little, in other words, if all that I did for you was not enough, I would add to you as much more. In other words, I'd double it. If you needed it, I'd double it. So question, verse 9. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? Now, in verse 8, God gives him 3 reasons that he should have had no reason to covet Bathsheba, to desire Bathsheba. Number 1, aside from the fact that he's already a married man, has several wives of his own. Just take them completely out of the picture for a minute. Number 1, Saul's harem was his. So Saul apparently kept a retinue of women for himself. Well, that becomes David's when he becomes king. More than that, he says, I gave all of Israel and Judah to you. In other words, he could have chosen virgins from all over, all the tribes. And number 3, if that wasn't enough, I'd have given you more than that. But then you pick up at verse 9, and from verse 9 down to verse 14, God specifies 3 sins and 3 punishments for those sins. So you look at verse 9, you've despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight. Why did you do that? Now, pause there for just a minute and think about this. Anytime we choose to do evil, anytime we choose sin, and it doesn't matter if it's a big sin as we think of things, or a little sin as we think of things, sin is sin is sin is sin. Anytime we choose to sin, we are despising the word of the Lord. We're basically taking God's instructions and saying, well, I just don't think that matters. If we would think about it in those terms every time we're tempted, the devil would have a much, much harder time persuading us to sin, wouldn't he? So, number 1, you've despised the word of the Lord. How so? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You committed murder. Now, David wasn't even there. He's back in the palace. When Uriah dies in battle, God says, you caused his death. You are the murderer. And the Ammonites that actually killed him, they're just accessories to the murder. Joab and the men of Israel that brought this about, they're accessories. The men that died because of your instructions, the implication, you're responsible for them too. but you've murdered Uriah, stolen his wife. You've taken his wife to be your wife and killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. So, number one, murder. David, David's a warrior. He's a man of blood. He has killed killed 200 Philistines just to marry Michal. Well, that turned out to be not much of a bargain, didn't it? He has killed plenty of people in battle. But now he has committed cold-blooded murder. There's the sin, verse 9. Here's the punishment, verse 10. The sword shall never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. You despised me, you committed murder, you tried to hide the fact, all rolled into one. God credited the guilt for Uriah's death to David in no uncertain terms, even though David acted through other people. So the fact that his hand didn't hold the sword is beside the point. But then go down to verse 11. He says, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. So, number two, you committed adultery, you took another man's wife, you will be punished by having someone take your wives. Well, that's going to be who? It's going to be his own son, Absalom, trying to overthrow him. Absalom will go to his father's harem in the sight of all Israel, as if to claim them for himself, a mark that he has become the king. Of course, Absalom's not going to survive, but David will be humiliated by that. And of course, those women, David will have nothing to do with them from that point forward, because they'll be considered defiled. But now notice, number one, murder. Number two, adultery. Sword will never depart. Your wives will be defiled. Number three, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord, verse 13. Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Nevertheless, verse 14, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. Now, both the King James and the American Standard translations here emphasize you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme in those translations. In other words, you've caused the people to blaspheme. A consequence of hypocrisy by God's people in any time is that those who oppose God blaspheme when God's people fall short. Look at Romans chapter 2, and in verses 23 and 24, Paul talks about the hypocrisy of the children of Israel, the Jews, and he says, look, their behavior, as we're holier than everybody else and so on and so forth, that caused the Gentiles to blaspheme against God. Well, this is what David has done. You have utterly scorned the Lord, caused the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, to speak out against, to rail against the name of the Lord. And because of this, what's the penalty? This child will not survive. This child will die. His sins were committed in private. hidden away. Now, they were not utterly unknown because somebody knew he had asked about that pretty woman. Somebody knew that they had been sent to bring her to him. Somebody had probably escorted her home after the fact. Servants being servants, you know there was talk in the palace. So David had not hidden it, but he tried to. His sins were committed privately, more or less, but they're going to be punished very publicly. And so you look down at verses 15 through 23, and what happens? Well, Bathsheba carries the child to term, gives birth to a live child, and David begs and pleads, and the child dies. So it's 8:15. Let's take our break here. We'll come back at 8 o'clock and finish up. We'll pick up at verse 15 and then go on into chapter 13, chapter 14. Comments or questions before we take a break?
We're going back to 13 and 14.
We're going to pick up in the middle of chapter 12, and then we'll look at chapters 13 and 14. We'll pick up right where we left off. All right. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 12 at verse 15. And from verse 15 down to verse 23, we have the consequences, the immediate consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba. Notice it says, the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child. David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor would he eat food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. So, she carries the child to term. The child is afflicted in some way by the Lord. It dies on the seventh day. Now, what's significant about that?
On the Sabbath, right?
Well, it's not necessarily the Sabbath day, and 7 does typically signify completion or totality.
The 8th day is when they were named and circumcised.
There you go. The child dies before it would be named and circumcised and considered part of the lineage of David in Israel. So this child basically dies unnamed, not part of David's lineage. Now, where God is concerned, this is an innocent child. So there's no concern for the child's spiritual welfare. The child is innocent. But as far as the child having a name and a heritage in Israel among the people, nope. God is not going to permit that. This is the child of sin. David spends this time begging God. And here's a point to think about. How long has David had to think about his crimes, basically? All the time that she's been pregnant.
Yeah.
Now, how soon did she know she was pregnant?
Immediately. Don't know.
Doesn't say, but in Texas, the pro-life law, or as the media reports it, the anti-abortion law, says 6 weeks. You can't go beyond that. And the complaint is most women don't know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. Well, How long did David have between the time he married Bathsheba and this child was born? At least several months, probably 7, 8 months.
But she was pregnant while they got married.
Yeah, she was already pregnant when they married. How far along was she? Don't know. Enough to know that she was pregnant. Now, the child is born and becomes sick. And now David is pleading with God. And God is saying no. So, on the 7th day, child dies. Servants are afraid to tell David. Eventually, David notices them whispering amongst themselves and simply asks, "Is the child dead?" Yes, he is. And at this point, the king blows their minds. They've been afraid to tell him because he's been distraught, unwilling to eat, pleading with God, face down on the ground. Well, if he's that upset while the child's sick, what will he do when he finds out that it's dead? They've been afraid to tell him. And what does he do?
Rose up and then washed and anointed himself.
Okay. Got up, cleaned up,
Cleaned up.
dressed up, went and ate. And that was not at all the response they expected from him. Why aren't you in mourning? Why aren't you hysterical? The child has died. You've been pleading all this time. Now the child has died. Why are you not upset? And look at his response. While he was still alive, verse 22, I fasted and I wept, and this is my reasoning. Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child will live? In other words, maybe God will change his mind. What had God already told him? This child is going to die. He's begging God, change your mind, change your mind, change your mind. God does not change his mind. Okay, you're God and I'm not. You've done what you said you were going to do. While he was still alive, I pleaded and begged for him. Now that he's dead, why should I fast? What good does it do to be upset now? Can I bring him back? I will go where he is, but he will not return to me. I shall go where he is. I shall go to him. In other words, David says, look, he's dead and gone. And sooner or later, I'll be dead and gone. I'll be gone where he is. We know how this world works. But I can't bring him back to me. What's the point in fussing about it?
But is it also, the passage, is it also indicating that David accepted God's final decision?
Yeah, clearly. Clearly, David, God told him this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And David says, okay, he's still alive. There's hope. While there's life, there's hope. I'll plead and beg. The child dies. Okay. God did exactly what he said he was going to do.
Right.
There's no point in me complaining or objecting or fussing at God for doing what he said he was going to do. God is just. It's interesting. David has had all of this time, months of Bathsheba's pregnancy, to dread. God said this child's going to die. And yet here's Bathsheba growing, baby moving in her womb and so forth. All this time, what's he doing? He's hoping, well, baby's not dead yet. Maybe God's changed his mind. Maybe God will let the child live. It's an innocent child, surely. Well, now we get right down to it. Child is sick. God said the child would die. The child died. Okay. It does tell us something about David's grasp of God, that he looks at this and says, all right, this is fair. This is what God said. So he doesn't object. I shall go to him. He shall not return to me. But now, here's something significant in our dealing with our own children, an important lesson. God has punished David. He's done what he said he would do. The punishment is over. David comforted his wife Bathsheba, went into her, lay with her, and she bore a son. And David called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jedidiah, which means beloved of the Lord.
That's what Jedidiah means.
Jedidiah, beloved of the Lord, because of the Lord. In other words, the birth of Solomon basically, in David's mind, confirms that God has said, okay, we're done with that. You've paid for that sin. I've forgiven. We're done. We're okay now. And God gives the name, beloved of the Lord. Now, this child is significant because this child will ultimately be the next king. This is not David's oldest son. This is not, this child is not one that would have been expected to become king. But this will be Solomon the king, the successor to David.
My question has always been, I think we talked about it before, God took a bad situation and made it good. Here, I wouldn't have expected Solomon to come out of Bathsheba, out of all the.
Yeah.
So I was always wondering, was he, because of David's sincere forgiveness and true heart for him, and maybe Bathsheba's sorrow, they had another son, but he goes on to be the builds
the temple. Yeah.
the temple.
Yeah.
So
How is, okay, that's a worthy question. How is it that God uses Bathsheba to provide the next king? Well, not to be crude about it, but who does David have at his disposal? He's got Saul's harem. He's got all of his other wives. He's got a whole passel of kids. But here, here, God is demonstrating basically, your penalty's been paid. This is forgiven. Now, from verse 26 down to the end of the chapter, the last paragraph, you have Rabbah, the city of the Ammonites, finally being conquered.
pardon me.
Thank you. It's that cleaner they're using in here. So, at this point, David's army, under Joab's leadership, They've probably come back and forth during planting and harvesting season, but they've been fighting for a couple of years against Rabbah. Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and took the royal city. He'd taken everything except the stronghold, the highest point. And at this point, he's ready to take that. And he sends word for David. I have fought against Rabbah. I have taken the city of waters. Now then, gather the rest of the people together and camp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called by my name. So he sends word to David. All right, we're ready to finish this. Now you need to come and get credit for it, David.
This is Joab.
This is Joab sending word. You need to come and get credit for this. You know, if David had been where he should have been 2 years before, they might have been done with this 2 years ago. If David, at the beginning of chapter 11, had been with Joab and the army at Rabbah, then this might have been conquered 2 years ago.
So you're saying this same war was the war he was fighting when he was with Bathsheba?
Yep.
Instead of being in out in front of the army, he was with Bathsheba.
Yep. Go back to chapter 11 and verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and laid siege against Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Now, if David had been there, you might not have had a 2-year siege, because you have the whole year that Bathsheba is pregnant with the illegitimate child, and it's born, and then it dies. And some point after that, you have the whole next year that she's pregnant with Solomon, and he's born. And after that, now comes word for, so you've got at least 2 years that have passed that they have besieged Rabbah. It's taken them 2 years to conquer the city. It's taken them at least the lives of Uriah and those men that were killed when he was murdered. If David had just been where he was supposed to be, this might, just speculation on my part, but if David had been where he should have been, this might have been over 2 years before. So now, come get credit for it.
Of it near the end, he still wasn't there. Joab took care of the whole situation.
It appears that Joab has done the whole job. And David doesn't, we don't have any record that David was ever anywhere near it until the very end. So now we're ready to conquer, ready to go in and finish the job. Verse 29, David gathered all the people together, went to Rabbah, fought against it, took the crown of their king from his head. The weight of it was a talent of gold. Well, a talent nominally is about 75 pounds. Kind of hard to imagine a 75-pound crown, but it may well be that that was its value, not its actual pound weight. In it was a precious stone. It was placed on David's head. He brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount, brought out the people who were in it, set them to labor with saws and iron picks and iron axes, made them toil at the brick kilns.
So he enslaved them.
So he put them, whether it was in slavery or forced service, indentured servitude, you might call it, regardless, they were working for him. They had to pay tribute to him, if nothing else. So, victory and spoils. But now look down here at verse 31. He put them to labor. He did this to all the cities of the Ammonites, and David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. So he did this to all the cities. Most probably what he did was he demanded payment, a tribute, and this is how you pay it. You work in these industries and you provide these building materials. You've got victory, that's good. You've got loot or spoils, hey, to the victor go the spoils. But verse 31, that sounds pretty cruel. And you flip over to Amos chapter 1. And notice that God speaks to that subject of cruelty. In Amos chapter 1, in verses 13, 14, and 15. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of the Ammonites, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they have ripped open pregnant women in Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. So I will kindle a fire in the wall of Rabbah, and it shall devour her strongholds, with shouting on the day of battle, with a tempest in the day of the whirlwind, and their king shall go into exile, he and his princes together, says the Lord. So we look at that and we say that sounds like a really cruel punishment for David to impose on them. But then you look at what Amos says by inspiration. Well, lo and behold, it wasn't so cruel after all, was it? Because it was God's retribution for what the Ammonites had done to the Israelites. It's payback. That's right. And payback is a bummer.
So what he basically did is took over their territory, but let them maintain their territory, but required them something.
But basically, he put them to
had
work
some
for him.
control. He had some control over that territory.
Yes, he dominated the territory and basically put them to work for him, for his nation, for Israel. So they were a subjugated people. Were they outright slaves? Apparently not, but that far away from it for all practical purposes. And yet it wasn't just cruelty, it was justice. And justice can look harsh sometimes, can't it?
But it never signifies that he was as cruel as Egypt was.
No. No, he never did anything like the Egyptians.
Right.
He was tough, but there was a reason for it. Well, flip over to chapter 13. And we don't know how much, if any, time passes between the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13. There may have been some passing of years, but Absalom, David's son, is one of his older children. This would go back to probably before he had become king that this boy is born. Absalom has a sister. Her name is Tamar, a beautiful girl. And Amnon, another one of David's sons, loved her, except that word loved signifies in verse 1, he lusted for her.
He wants to what?
He lusted for her. He wanted her.
Why?
It wasn't he fell in love. It was, boy, she's hot. She's cute. I want her. So the stage is set. Absalom and Tamar share the same mother and father. Amnon and Tamar share the same father, but not the same mother. The stage is set. Well, what kind of child rearing causes this? Well, what does David have? David has, call it a blended family. David has a polygamous family. You've got one daddy and a whole bunch of mamas. David has basically a string of baby mamas. He's king, so he can afford a bunch of them.
And these are from the other nations too,
But,
right?
well, no, these are, as far as we know, these are all Israelite girls.
These are Israelite girls.
But Andrew Connolly, an older preacher who's now gone to his reward, used to do mission work in what was then Tanganyika, Tanzania, Africa, which is predominantly a Muslim country. Muslim law allows a Muslim man to have as many as 4 wives at once. And Andrew's comment about that situation was, if you want to see the most miserable creature on earth, you find a Muslim man who has 4 wives, because they are always in competition with each other.
Mhm.
And he can never keep them all happy at the same time. So one of them's always mad at him. Well, now take David. David's got all of his wives, and he's got Solomon's concubines, or Saul's concubines or harem or whatever. He's got a whole house full of children who are mostly half siblings. They all have the same daddy, but different mamas. And they're all competing with each other to be the favorite. The mamas are competing to be the favorite wife. The children are competing to be the favorite child. And in the meantime, here's Amnon looking at Tamar, his sister, half sister, and what's going through his mind? Lust. He's not in love with her. To put it bluntly, he's in heat for her. And so at verse 2, Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar. For she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. So she's innocent. We don't see anything here that indicates that she was leading him on or anything like that. But he is obsessed with her. Doesn't see any way that he can have what he wants. But here's Jonadab, his cousin. Jonadab is the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, one of David's older brothers. And Jonadab was the English Standard Version says he was a very crafty man.
It's like subtle.
A subtle man, yeah.
Subtle, like
He was a skunk.
he was a stud,
A skunk.
a skunk,
He was a schemer.
a schemer.
Yep. So Amnon has evil desire. His heart is filled with lust for an innocent girl. Jonadab is going to help him get what he wants. Evil will always find a friend. Evil desire will always find a friend. So, come down here. Jonadab says to him, Prince, O son of the king, why are you so haggard? Why are you so thin morning after morning? You're getting sick. What's going on with you? So Amnon tells him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Now, he might have used the word love, but the gist of what he was saying is, I've got the hots for her. I want her. Look at verse 5. You know, in verse 3, evil will always find a friend. And in verse 5, evil friends will always have evil plans. So at verse 5, you go fake being sick. Go take to your bed, fake being sick. When your father comes to see you, ask for Tamar to be your nurse, to take care of you. Let her fix your meals and so forth. So, all right. He puts his scheme, his lust into action. Deceives, pretends to be sick. He's not sick except with lust. The king came to see him and, Daddy, can I have Tamar take care of me? So David says, Tamar, go look after your brother. Go to your brother Amnon's house, prepare food for him. She went to her brother's house. He's lying down. She fixes the food, made the food right there. He watched her. She took the pan after she'd cooked it, and he wouldn't eat. No, too sick to eat. Send everyone out from me and let Tamar feed me. I don't want anybody to see her feed me. I'm too weak to feed myself or something like that. Now, Amnon has made this request for her under false pretenses, hasn't he? It's an evil request because he's deceiving in everything he's doing. All right, now he's maneuvered to have her feed him, basically, as if he's too weak to feed himself. And come down here at verse 11. She brought the bread, the cakes near, so that he could eat. And he took hold of her and said, come lie with me, my sister. Lie with me. He's not inviting her to sit on the edge of the bed. He may not be inviting at all, but whether he is asking her to participate or not, he's going to end up committing rape. Notice verse 12. She demurred. She refused. Do not violate me. This is not what God's people do. But such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing, the English Standard Version says. Now, at verses 12 and 13, she tries to reason with him, gives him several reasons to not rape her, to not force her. And that even includes asking their father if he could marry her. Now, why would she do that? Well, she might have thought, and maybe not without some basis given David's own behavior, maybe she thought that he would violate the law and give her in marriage to Amnon. You know, the law in Israel did not allow brothers and sisters to marry, even half siblings. It was considered unclean. But David had not been exactly perfect himself. So maybe she thought, well, he might allow this. Maybe she knew that David would not allow this, and that would be her excuse. Well, you know, we asked and he said no, and that would be enough for Amnon. Regardless of what her reasoning was, she's acting honorably in this. She's trying to prevent him from committing sin and dragging her into it. She is not a willing participant in this. This is rape, not what our law calls statutory rape, where she's a willing participant. She's not willing here. But look at verse 14. he would not listen. In verse 13, speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you. He'll let you marry me. He's not interested in marriage, though. He's not in love with her at all. He would not listen. Being stronger, he violated her. He raped her. And then he's done with it. He's finished. The sin is completed. His lust has been satisfied, and he's done with her. And when he's done with her, he wants nothing more to do with her. You look at verse 15, he hated her with very great hatred. In other words, I am done with you. I have no more. She was not a sister in his mind. She was not a friend or an honorable woman, or she was just something to be used in his mind. And when he was done with her, he was done with her. And his desire is gone. And now he wants her out of his sight. What had been the object of his desire, well, now she's not the unattainable desire. Now she's just a defiled woman. Never mind that he's the one who defiled her. He doesn't want her anywhere around. And he puts her out in verses 16 and 17, throws her out basically as if she's the one that started it all. Look at the end of verse 15. Amnon said to her, get up, go, get out of my sight, basically. And she tries to calm him down, to reason with him. No, this is wrong. Sending me away is greater than the other that you, in other words, throwing me out like trash, that just compounds this. This is worse than being raped. And he has no interest. He would not listen to her. Calls for his servants, the young man who served him. Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door. Throw her out and lock the door. I don't want her around. He is cold because he is focused only on himself. Now, you go on here, and at verse 18, she had been acknowledged, she had been known, was dressed as a virgin. Her manner of dress announced that she was an innocent woman, a virgin, up to this point, wearing a long robe or a long tunic with sleeves. Thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out, bolted the door. She put ashes on her head and tore the long robe and went away crying aloud. So what she does announces to anybody that sees her, something has happened. Her status has changed, and it wasn't her choice.
So all of the community knew her status had changed.
Everybody in the palace is going to know something has happened. Something bad has happened to her. And so Absalom figures this out immediately. At verse 19, she put ashes on her head, but put her hand on her head, tore the robe, bewails her circumstances. The figure of speech, her hand on her head, God's hand is heavy on her head. She's feeling like she's being punished, even though she's innocent. And so Absalom knows. Absalom figures this out. Now, how would Absalom figure this out?
she's been,
Well, I mean, how would he figure out that it's Amnon? Well, they're half brothers. They live in the same town. They live in the same, they move in the same circles. They live in the same house, basically.
right?
Absalom is a man. Amnon is a man, sort of. Absalom is not stupid. And he's not blind. He may very well have seen Amnon drooling, as it were, over his sister. And so he just asks, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? And the question, it's a rhetorical question. He knows the answer. He puts the pieces together. He's figured this out. Look at his instructions. Hold your peace. You don't make a big deal about this, Tamar. You keep quiet about it. Don't take this to heart. Basically, he's saying this shouldn't count against you. But notice, Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. So she moves out of David's palace, her father's house, and moves in with her brother, a desolate woman. That is, she is, at this point, she's not going to entertain any thought or prospect of a happy marriage or any kind of marriage. She is living basically as an abandoned woman. And David heard all of these things. He was aware of what happened. Sooner or later, he's privy to all of the information that his own son raped his own daughter. His son raped his sister. And he was angry. But he didn't punish Amnon either. He didn't condone what Amnon did, but he also did not punish what Amnon did. Why not? Why would David not punish him?
We're seeing that same, flippant attitude with Uriah. It seems like, okay, no big deal.
Well, you may be right. David, looking at what Amnon, his son, has done, may be seeing himself in the mirror, basically, because that's what David did to Uriah. The one difference being Bathsheba was not an innocent virgin. Bathsheba was, as far as we can tell, the innocent wife of another man. But David doesn't discipline Amnon. And it may be that he would feel like, well, how can I scold him? How can I discipline him when I've done basically the same thing? Wouldn't I be a hypocrite to do that? But that doesn't enter into it, shouldn't enter into it. If I have committed sin and paid for my sin, and my child then commits the same sin, am I supposed to overlook that because, well, I've done that, so I don't have any ground to speak? No, if anything, I ought to be hard to not let that go by because I have paid that penalty. But he doesn't. And at verse 22, Absalom refuses then to even speak to Amnon. He has very intense hatred for him because he had raped his sister. Well, verses 23 down to the end of the chapter now give us Absalom's revenge. And for Tamar, Absalom does this on Tamar's behalf, basically. But Absalom does this also with a political eye. What's the relationship between Absalom and Amnon? They're half brothers, same father, different mothers. Who's their father?
David,
David. And who's David?
the king.
He's the king. So, okay, David's, let's say he's in his 50s. He's getting older. Sooner or later, he's going to die. What happens when the king dies?
The son's supposed to be his successor.
Somebody is going to become the new king. Now, David's got a whole house full of sons. Absalom's got ambition. Amnon has abused Absalom's sister, and David didn't do anything about it. If I get rid of Amnon, not only does that avenge my sister, now mind you, she didn't ask him to, but that's one step less that I have to take to be the next king. That's one more obstacle out of my way. So he doesn't speak a word to him. And after 2 full years, he just lets it go by, never says a word about it, never confronts him about it, doesn't speak to him at all. Now he's got sheep shearers at Baal Hazor near Ephraim, and he invites all of the king's sons, in other words, all of his brothers. Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. And the king said, no, not all of us. We don't want to be burdensome. We don't want to cost you that much. In other words, he proposes to throw a celebration, a party. Bring the whole household, all the sons, bring the king. It may be that he planned to either do something or reveal what Amnon had done. We don't know that. But the king says, no, we don't want to be that much of a burden to you. Well, all right then. Let my brother Amnon go with me. David's not stupid. He surely knows that Absalom has had zero to do with Amnon for the last 2 years. And he knows why. Tamar is Absalom's sister.
Tamar is Absalom's sister.
Yep. And it's Amnon that had raped her.
Right.
And so he says, well, let Amnon go with me. Well, why? But he pressed him. Absalom pressed him until he agreed, until he let Amnon go, and all the king's sons with him. So basically, Absalom wore him down and then gave the orders. You pay attention. When Amnon is drunk, when his heart is merry with wine, then kill him. When I tell you to, you kill him. And don't you worry about it. You're obeying my orders. In other words, I take responsibility for it. And so the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom commanded. all of the king's sons arose and each mounted his mule and fled. So when this happens, all of David's sons are there. They see this, they hear this, they know who gave the order, they know who is responsible. Now, David had said, we don't want to be a burden to you. And Absalom basically ensures Amnon's presence in verses 25 and 26 and 27. I'll cover the cost, as it were. At verses 28 and 29, when Absalom actually carries out his plan and causes Amnon's death, this, not the death of Bathsheba's first child, this death is the beginning of the first curse from God. Go back to chapter 12, look at verses 9 through 14, and what does God say about David's sin with Bathsheba? Through Nathan, you've despised the word of the Lord, the sword shall never depart from your house. The death of Bathsheba's son was not part of that punishment that God decreed. That was separate. This is the beginning of that curse. And verses 30 and 31, bad news travels fast, and it's usually exaggerated. Look at how it gets back to David. While they were on the way, the other sons, Absalom has no designs on them right now. But what word comes back to David? Absalom has murdered all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. And the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth, and his servants tore their garments. Well, bad news travels fast, and it usually is exaggerated, and it was here. He had murdered one son, Amnon the rapist. Did Amnon deserve what he got?
The penalty for sin is death.
Okay. The wages of sin is death, and specifically under the law of Moses, the penalty for rape is death. So on the one hand, we could say Amnon got exactly what he deserved. But it was not Absalom's place to act as judge, jury, and executioner. That was David's place. Absalom has usurped David's authority in this. So the word comes back, all the king's sons are dead and they're mourning, but you get to verse 32, and now Jonadab, wait a minute, who's Jonadab?
Cousin.
That's right. He is David's nephew, Absalom's cousin, Amnon's cousin. He is, what's his name's son? Shemaiah. He's the son of one of David's older brothers. And Jonadab puts this together immediately. What do we know about Jonadab? He's a schemer. He's a schemer. He's a politician. He figures this out. Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, said, "Let not my lord suppose they killed all the young men. Amnon alone is dead by the command of Absalom, because he violated Tamar." You almost wonder if Jonadab didn't have the inside track on this. Jonadab is the kind of guy that would not be above playing both ends against the middle. But Absalom fled. Now you look at verses 37, 38, 39. He's going to go to, Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons have come. As your servant said, so it has come about. Verse 35. As soon as he finished speaking, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept, and the king also. They all wept very bitterly. In the meantime, go back to verse 34. Where's Absalom? Absalom fled.
To his uncles.
Absalom ran away. Yeah, verse 34, he ran away. The sentinels, the men who kept watch, saw him. People were coming behind him, that is, chasing him. And he runs to his grandfather. At verse 37, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son day after day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, was there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. Now that's an interesting turn of events, as it were. Absalom goes to his grandfather. That takes us back to chapter 3 and verse 3, the connection to Talmai there. He goes away from Israel, basically, where it's safe. And you look at David's spirit, and this seems puzzling to us. David longed to go out to Absalom. That is, he wanted him. Now, the Latin, Jerome's translation, the Latin Vulgate says that he ceased to go out to Absalom, but that is, he was comforted in Amnon's. In other words, in an ironic way, Absalom had solved a problem for David in murdering Amnon. David is basically, he's harbored a rapist for 2 years.
Right.
And he's raped David's own child. He is David's child, but he raped David's child. So, this has been an awkward, embarrassing. David was angry about that, angry with Amnon, but he hasn't done anything. Well, now Absalom has taken things into his own hands, and even though he did not have the right to do it, from a practical point of view, basically he's kind of solved the problem for David. And the last thing David wants is more turmoil, more drama, more alienation and separation among his own children. But here's Absalom living in a foreign country, basically, among heathen people. And that doesn't reflect well on David in a sense, that his own son doesn't feel safe in his house. And so it's an upsetting, distressing time for David. Well, that brings us to chapter 14, and Absalom is going to come back to Jerusalem ultimately, but that'll be part of next week's class because our time is up. So if you would, read ahead, pick up in 14 and just go on and be working on those term papers, and Lord willing, I'll see you next week. Questions or thoughts or comments?
Sounds like a little Peyton place to me.
I was thinking much the same thing. And, you know, you look at Britain's royal family today, something about being royalty, they don't have good sense, do they?
No,
And all the money, I know not the common sense.
All the brain, all the money and no brains. Yeah.
well, have a good evening, everybody.
Okay, Rick.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Love y'all.
Good night.